Thanks so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for convening this important subcommittee hearing. And I want to thank our witnesses also, many of whom have traveled a pretty far distance in order to be here. I've introduced two bills that'll be on today's legislative hearing agenda. S-2136, the Utah State Parks Adjustment Act, and S-1405, the Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration Exchange Act of 2023. These bills will improve land management in the great state of Utah while also promoting responsible stewardship and local control. In particular, I'd like to thank Director Michelle McConkey of the Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration. That is a mouthful, but she's up to the task of handling this entity with a big name and an even bigger task. The entity known as SITLA is much easier to pronounce when you don't use the whole name. Director McConkey, of course, grew up in rural Utah and has worked for SITLA in a number of capacities over the last 2 decades and has developed a real expertise and a strong reputation for professionalism and competency in this area. She's someone who personally understands the needs of rural communities and the many nuances of public land and public land management. Under her leadership, SITLA ensures that roughly $95 million of funding per year are responsibly generated and dispersed from SITLA into a trust fund for the benefit of Utah's public schools. For the non-Utahns in the room, SITLA trust lands are parceled in individual 1 square mile sections. And if you've ever looked at a map of Utah, you'll notice that it resembles a checkerboard. And one of the many reasons for this is because the unique layout of SITLA's lands, where Utah was given sections 2, 16, 32, and 36 to each 36-mile township, creating this nice checkerboard formation and a pattern that if we suddenly didn't have the ability to write would be easily recognizable to anyone as SITLA lands. SITLA is tasked with managing roughly 3.4 million acres of trust lands in Utah, and also the revenues generated from the lands in the most prudent and profitable manner possible, and not for any purpose inconsistent with the best interests of the trust beneficiaries. Trust lands, unlike public lands, are lands allocated by Congress to generate revenue to support specific state institutions, including state schools, public schools in the state, and also state hospitals. The proceeds generated by the program are deposited into a trust fund totaling over $2 billion today. Led by Director McConkey, SITLA works really hard and very effectively to ensure that the trust lands of Utah generate the economic prosperity to fund public institutions and create economic opportunity, particularly for rural communities. It's been a privilege to work with SITLA, as well as various people from the state of Utah, the Bureau of Land Management, and other local stakeholders in creating consensus-driven land exchange to benefit the school kids and rural communities of Utah. So I'm pleased to present legislation that codifies a memorandum of understanding signed by Governor Cox and Secretary Holland. This MOU facilitates the exchange of 162,000 acres of state trust land within the Bears Ears National Monument for 167,000 acres of BLM land elsewhere in the state. To be sure, there's nothing about this bill that means that many issues surrounding the designation of the Bears Ears National Monument somehow been settled. Far from it. Through an abuse of the Antiquities Act, over 1.3 million acres of land in San Juan County, the poorest county in Utah, was locked up in a new national monument overnight. Despite opposition from local communities and the entire Utah congressional delegation at the time when this occurred on December 28th, 2016. San Juan County is forced to deal with the burdens created by the monument designation, increased costs associated with law enforcement, search and rescue, road maintenance, waste, and visitation, and is unable to generate much revenue, all because of a restrictive monument designation the size of Delaware within one county. Given these issues, the decision to proceed with this land exchange was a complicated, delicate, and sometimes a harrowing process that came a long way over the last 2 years. While certainly not a perfect deal, this exchange strikes a balance, a fair balance, It's been driven by local stakeholder input. The bill presents a unique opportunity to provide economic development opportunities that will provide serious long-term benefits to the school children of Utah. The current trust lands within the Bears Ears National Monument, within the boundaries of that monument, generate little revenue for the school trust. SITLA has gone above and beyond the call of duty to identify parcels throughout the state, and especially, particularly in San Juan County, which have potential to generate revenue and otherwise be sources of economic development. This bill has received letters of support from Carbon County, San Pete County, Sevier, Millard, Duchesne, Beaver, Emery, and Uintah counties, along with Governor Spencer Cox, as well as other leaders, including tribal leaders and conservation groups. I ask unanimous consent that these letters be entered into the record.
Without objection.
I'd also like to highlight another piece of legislation, S 2136, which would convey a few small parcels of federal land to the state of Utah. These parcels are either in holdings or they're located directly adjacent to Utah state park boundaries. A lot of people remember Utah for our national parks, which are fantastic, and I'd encourage everyone to use them and visit them. We're less well known for our state parks, which are well managed, well staffed, well cared for, and really beautiful places. State parks play a vital role in promoting outdoor recreation, tourism, and economic growth in Utah. However, the presence of federal enclaves and fragmented ownership, exacerbated by the fact that the federal government owns 2/3 of the land in Utah, tends to create unnecessary bureaucratic hurdles and land management inefficiencies that complicate all sorts of endeavors, including the management of state parks. These parcels include additions to the Wasatch Mountain State Park, Antelope Island State Park, and Fremont State Park. By transferring title of these small parcels of land to the state, we'll consolidate land ownership, simplify management, and enhance the overall efficiency of our state park system. This will enable the Utah State Park system to better preserve and protect these natural treasures for future generations. I thank the members for their thoughtful consideration of these bills that are before us today, and I hope today's testimony can help satisfy and resolve any concerns that members of the subcommittee might have, and that we'll be able to expedite these bills out of committee and into legislation on the floor with all due haste and deliberate speed. Thank you, and yield back my time.